The bone lantern shattered against the revolver's barrel, and thousands of blue sparks erupted outward. Each one a voice, each one a broken promise screaming as it tore through flesh. Sheriff Vance's skin turned translucent. The sparks weren't light, they were people, and they were leaving him. 13 hours earlier, Elias Quinn sat in his basement office with a green glass of lukewarm whiskey. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting its pale glow across the desktop scrap heap of yellowed newspaper clippings and faded photographs. Dust motes danced in the cone of light from the iron desk lamp. Elias leaned forward, his right hand gripping the glass, his left thumb rubbing at a smudge on a blurry 1954 photograph. The image showed a figure in a burlap coat, little more than a shadow against a gray background. A grandfather clock ticked somewhere in the basement, marking time with mechanical precision. Elias had looked at this photograph for 23 years without really seeing it. The heavy bang on the basement door made him flinch. Whiskey sloshed from the glass and landed on a map dated 1892. The amber liquid spreading across the paper like a stain he'd never be able to remove. The door flew open, hitting the stone wall with a crack that echoed through the basement. A man stood in the doorway, soaked through with rain. Water dripped from his chin onto the threshold. His name was Miller, and his chest heaved as if he'd run miles to get here. Miller strode forward, his heavy boots leaving muddy prints on the gray concrete floor. He slammed something onto the desk, a gold locket tarnished and broken. The hinge was twisted, revealing a small photograph of a young girl with blonde pigtails. Her name was Lily. He took her, Elias. Miller's voice came out as a hoarse whisper, cracking with grief. The lantern man. I promised her I'd never leave, but I fell asleep. I woke up, and he was in the backyard, just standing there. Elias picked up the locket with trembling fingers. He turned it over, examining the damage. On the back, crudely scratched into the gold, were words carved fresh into the metal. The scratches caught the light, the metal still bright in the grooves. Promise broken. Elias's jaw dropped. He looked up at Miller with sudden alarm, but Miller was already moving. The carpenter grabbed him by the collar of his tweed vest and pulled Elias's face inches from his own. Miller's breath smelled of stale beer and fear, the kind of fear that only comes when everything you love has been taken. You're the one who knows the old ways, Miller said, his voice breaking. Fix this, or I'll burn this town to find her. Miller released him and walked back out into the rain. The basement door swung slowly closed behind him, leaving Elias alone with the locket and the whiskey and the growing knowledge that something in Oakhaven had awakened. 2 hours later, Elias stood at the edge of the Blackwood marsh. A narrow gravel path stretched before him into fog so thick it seemed solid. He held a heavy iron flashlight in his right hand. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating twisted tree roots that looked like claws reaching up from the earth. The air smelled of sulfur and rot, a smell that didn't belong to any natural place. He moved carefully down the path, his light step deliberate. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. In the distance, frogs croaked their evening songs, oblivious to the wrongness that hung over the marsh. The attack came without warning. A shadow lunged from behind a rotted oak tree, a heavy branch swinging low. It caught Elias on his left shoulder, and pain exploded down his arm. He spun, losing his grip on the flashlight. It flew from his hand and landed in the mud, its beam pointing uselessly away into the mist. Behind him, the shape became clearer. A figure wearing a tattered, filth-covered poncho that hung like rags from a skeletal frame. Elias backed away, but the figure rushed him, tackling him to the ground. They rolled together in the marshy grass, and Elias managed to get his hands around the attacker's throat. But the attacker was stronger than any human should be, pushing a muddy hand over Elias's mouth and nose, cutting off his air. Black spots bloomed in Elias's vision. In desperation, Elias reached into his pocket and found his brass lighter. He swung it upward with everything he had left. The metal connected with the side of the attacker's head. The attacker groaned and went limp. Elias kicked, pushing the figure away into the deeper fog until only the lower half of the body was visible. Then that too disappeared into the murk. Elias lay gasping in the mud, his heart hammering against his ribs. He forced himself to stand, retrieved his flashlight, and swept the beam across the area. The light caught on a fence post nearby. Hanging from a rusted nail was a small, braided blue hair ribbon. Elias knew that ribbon. He'd seen it in photographs at Miller's house. And carved into the wood below it, in letters that looked as fresh as the morning, "Keep the secret." The town archive room was locked, but Elias had a set of lockpicks. He let himself in through the back entrance just after 1 in the morning. His hands shook as he worked the lock on a heavy iron cabinet labeled Property Records, 1850-1900. The metal clicked open, and he pulled out a leather-bound ledger with a silver clasp, his fingers leaving muddy prints on the cover. The ledger opened to a page dated October 14th, 1888. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, written by someone whose mind was tormented. Names filled the page. Arthur Finch, promise of silence. Silas Thorne, promise of loyalty. Each name had a red wax seal next to it. Elias turned the pages, watching the pattern repeat through decades. Different names, different promises, all sealed in red wax. Then he found it. His grandfather's name. William Quinn. Promise of protection. Result, taken. His hands trembled as he turned the page. There, in fresh black ink, dated today, was his own name. Elias Quinn. Promise of truth. The wax seal next to it was still soft and sticky, not yet dry. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Elias spun around, clutching the ledger to his chest. Sheriff Vance stood in the doorway, his hand resting on his leather holster. The shadow of his hat brim obscured his face, but when he stepped into the light, Elias saw that the sheriff wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a small glass jar, and inside the jar was a wick that flickered with a sickly violet light. "You shouldn't have looked for the truth, Elias," Vance said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "You promised to just keep the books. Now you're part of the collection." Elias ran. The corridor of the sheriff's office became a battlefield. When Vance reached for his handcuffs, Elias swung the heavy leather ledger like a club, catching him across the temple. The silver clasp cut Vance's forehead, and blood sprayed across the floor. Vance grunted and tackled Elias, pinning him against a row of metal filing cabinets. The cabinets groaned and dented under their weight. Vance's fingers dug into Elias's windpipe, crushing the breath from his lungs. Elias brought his knee up into Vance's groin. The sheriff doubled over. Elias grabbed a heavy stapler from a nearby desk and struck Vance on the back of the neck. Vance collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Elias ran toward the back exit. He kicked open a side window, and glass exploded outward in a shower of fragments. He rolled through the frame, landing on the gravel alleyway. Rain drenched him instantly, cold and relentless. The first safe place he thought of was Miller's cabin deep in the woods. He ran toward it through the darkness, the ledger tucked under his arm, his shoulders screaming with pain from the branch strike. The cabin was dark when he arrived, illuminated only by a dying fire. Miller sat in a rocking chair, staring at the wall. He didn't look up as Elias burst through the door. Elias dropped the ledger on the table, his breath coming in ragged gasps. That's when he noticed the smell, not wood smoke, but ozone. The sharp, electric smell of something wrong. He looked at Miller again. Miller's wrists were tied to the chair arms with thick rope that bit deep into the flesh. Miller finally looked at Elias. His eyes were streaming tears. He nodded toward the corner of the room. A tall, spindly figure stood in the dark, holding a lantern made of bone and twisted iron. The lantern began to glow with a pulsing, golden light. A soft, rhythmic clicking filled the room, like insects scratching at glass. "You give me the one promise you never kept." Elias looked at the clock on the wall. 3:15 a.m. The minute hand moved with an unnaturally fast tick-tick-tick. The sound too loud, the movement too rapid. 1 hour and 45 minutes. That's all he had. Panic flooded through him. He had to move. He had to do something. Elias kicked over a bucket of kerosene near the fireplace. The liquid spilled across the wooden floor, spreading toward the fire. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the kerosene ignited. The cabin erupted in a pillar of orange flame. Miller screamed, tied to his chair. The lantern man made no sound. In the chaos, Elias lunged forward. He grabbed the bone lantern's handle and dived through the cabin door into the swamp. The handle was cold, burning cold, like gripping ice. He sprinted through the marsh, his boots plunging into knee-deep black water. Submerged roots tripped him, and he fell face first. But he kept the lantern high, desperate to keep it dry. He scrambled up, water dripping from his chin. Behind him, the cabin burned like a pyre. The lantern man glided over the water, not touching the surface, moving faster than anything human could move. It reached out a long, skeletal hand and clawed at Elias's back, tearing through his tweed vest and drawing blood in 4 deep gashes. Elias screamed, a primal sound of pain and desperation. He swung the lantern upward like a flail. The bone frame connected with the creature's chest, and a burst of blue sparks exploded outward, pushing the lantern man backward. Elias used the moment to jump onto a floating log and push off into the deeper current. The water pulled him downstream, away from the burning cabin, away from the figure that now stood on the shore, watching him drift into the darkness. Elias collapsed inside a circle of dead, white-barked trees. He was surrounded. There was nowhere left to go. His legs had simply stopped working, his body unable to continue. He looked down at the lantern he was holding. Inside the glass, one of the blue sparks was larger than the others. It began to take form, a young woman in a graduation gown, reaching her hand against the inside of the glass. A soft, ghostly voice called out the word "Father." Memory struck Elias like a physical blow. He was at a hospital. A nurse was telling him something. His daughter had died. Infection. Nothing they could do. He had promised, his hand on her cold forehead, "I will never forget you." But then the whiskey. Year after year of whiskey, until the memory was gone. He'd burned her photographs. He'd erased her name from every paper in his house. He'd made himself believe she had never existed. Her name was Clara. She had been his daughter, and he had forgotten her. Elias touched the glass of the lantern. The spark inside brightened, reaching toward his fingertip. He realized then that the lantern man hadn't taken her. The lantern man had collected her, not stolen her, but collected her. Because Elias had broken his promise. The creature didn't create broken promises. It preserved them. It kept them safe in its lantern, holding them until someone was desperate enough to face what they'd done. The lantern man stood inches away now, just behind Elias's ear. The clicking sound intensified, a sound like bones tapping against glass. "Your turn," the creature whispered. A gunshot exploded through the night air. Sheriff Vance emerged from the trees, leveling his service revolver at Elias's head. His forehead was bandaged with a dirty rag, but his hand was steady. His eyes were cold and certain. "Give me the lantern, Elias," Vance said. His voice was steady, fanatical. "The town needs its secrets kept. I've fed it for 20 years. It keeps the peace." Elias stood up, holding the lantern out as if offering it. As Vance reached for it, Elias threw a handful of swamp mud into the sheriff's eyes and charged. They tackled each other, and the gun fired into the air. The sound was enormous, echoing off the white trees and frightening the crows into flight. They wrestled in the mud, and Vance was stronger. He slammed Elias's head into a tree root. Elias's vision blurred. Stars bloomed in his peripheral vision. Vance got his hand on the gun again and pressed it to Elias's ribs. Elias felt the cold metal against his skin beneath a torn shirt. This was the end, then. This was how it finished. Sheriff Vance would shoot him here in the mud, and the lantern man would collect his spark and add it to the others, and the town's secrets would be safe for another 20 years. But then Elias remembered something from the ledger. The archive entry had mentioned one thing above all others. Truth. The one thing that could break the cycle wasn't a sacrifice. It was truth spoken aloud. "Clara!" Elias screamed her name with every ounce of his soul. He raised the lantern above his head and brought it down hard against the gun barrel. The bone lantern shattered. The sound was like a million tiny bells breaking all at once. A blinding white-blue light erupted from the broken glass. Thousands of blue sparks flew outward, each one a voice, each one a broken promise screaming as it tore through the air. The light hit Vance. The sparks passed through his chest like bullets. His skin turned translucent. He screamed, a horrific, overlapping scream of many voices pouring out of his mouth. His badge melted and fell into the mud. His body became translucent, then transparent, then nothing. He simply ceased to be, his screams fading as the last of the sparks left him. The lantern man made no sound. It simply dissolved, its hair cloak falling to the ground like a pile of dusty rags. The clicking sound stopped. The wrongness that had hung over the marsh lifted. Elias sat in the mud. The sun began to peek over the horizon, casting gold beams across the swamp. The rags of the hair cloak lay empty beside him. Above him, two spirits hovered for a moment. The girl with blonde pigtails and the young woman in the graduation gown. They moved toward the sunlight, and then they were gone, dissolved into the warmth. The silence was absolute. Elias looked down at his hand. He was holding the lantern handle, but the bone and iron had fused to his skin. The metal was warm. Inside the empty glass frame, a new spark ignited, a small golden light that matched the rhythm of his heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. The sound came from the lantern, as if a tiny heart was beating inside it. His skin, where the iron touched him, had turned gray and papery, like old parchment. He tried to pull the handle away, but it was fused now. Part of him. The lantern man was gone, but the lantern remained. And Elias understood, standing there in the mud as the sun rose over Oakhaven, that someone had to carry it. Someone had to keep the collection safe. Someone had to be there when the next broken promise came looking for a home. That someone was him now. 3 nights later, a teenager stood by a park bench in the town square, whispering into his phone. "I promise I'll be there," he said. "I won't let you down, I swear." He hung up, guilt flickering across his face. He looked up. A tall figure in a tattered tweed vest walked past in the distance. A hair cloak hung from the figure's shoulders. In one hand was a lantern made of bone and iron, and inside it, a single blue spark pulsed with a golden light. The light reflected in the teenager's eyes. The figure moved deeper into the shadows of an alley. The clicking sound echoed softly between the buildings. Inside the lantern, a new spark began to form. Swirling around the glass, the hand that gripped the handle tightened. The fingers were gray and papery, marked by the iron that held the lantern. The cycle continued.